A dangerous game of thrones between the United States and Russia. President Trump approves new sanctions against Moscow. The Kremlin accuses the White House of launching a full-scale trade war. As the crisis deepens, what's behind this latest escalation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rochelle Carey. It was all-out verbal war this week as the United States imposed new sanctions on Russia. President Donald Trump signed the bill in private without his usual audience, and it came with a statement full of caveats. He began by saying the U.S. would side with its allies and friends against Russian subversion and destabilisation. But he said the bill remained seriously flawed, and he was signing it only for the sake of national unity. Then came the scathing response from the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who said the bill ends hopes for improving Russia's relations with the new U.S. administration. He said Trump had been fully outwitted and his administration had shown its total weakness by handing over executive power to Congress in the most humiliating way. Trump then tweeted that the U.S. relationship with Russia was at an all-time and very dangerous low, thanks to Congress. So a little later, the president was back in friendly territory, a rally in West Virginia, where he once again dismissed the investigation into Russian election meddling as a hoax.
Have you seen any Russians in West Virginia or Ohio or Pennsylvania? Are there any Russians here tonight? Any Russians? They can't beat us at the voting booths. So they're trying to cheat you out of the future and the future that you want. They're trying to cheat you out of the leadership you want with a fake story that is demeaning to all of us, and most importantly, demeaning to our country and demeaning to our Constitution.
Let's bring in our guests now. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is John Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and now director with the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, columnist with the Novaya Gazeta newspaper, where he specializes in Russian foreign policy and defense. And in London, Nilit Gevorgian, senior economist and country risk analyst at IHS Markit. And thank you to all of you. So I want to start with President Donald Trump's tweet, where he said, our relationship with Russia is at an all-time low, all-time and very dangerous low. You can thank Congress, the same people that can't even give us health care. Clearly, if you know history and you know the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know at the very least that things have been worse, at least between the U.S. and the greater Soviet Union, obviously. But having said that, John, how would you characterize relations right now between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, the relations are difficult because Russia is pursuing an aggressive revisionist foreign policy. They conducted war in Georgia, they're conducting war in Ukraine. Things are dangerous, but in fact, they're less dangerous today as a result of the sanctions policy. Because what you need is a policy of American strength, pushing back hard against Kremlin aggressive intentions.
I mean, we're going to actually talk about Ukraine. I'm glad you brought that up. But first, Pavel, I want you to as well characterize, how would you characterize relations between the U.S. and Russia right now?
Well, actually, what Donald Trump put into that tweet is more or less verbatim what the Russian establishment is saying. And Prime Minister Medvedev and many others are saying, yes, relations are very bad, all hope is lost. And that's all because of the Congress, the Russian, right now, establishment and the Russian TV propaganda continue to very much separate Donald Trump, that is basically good and wants to have good relations with Russia, with the American establishment that is anti-Russian, that has its center of power in Congress and is doing everything to spoil relations. And they're basically not maybe so much after Russia as they're after Trump. As Medvedev wrote, that this is just the beginning. They're going to continue attacks on Trump till they take him out of office. And the bottom line is that we're right now facing maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe more years of very bad Russian-American relations, continuing sanctions, standoffs, and some are even saying that there's a risk of direct military clashes between Russian and American militaries.
Okay. Wow. Okay, we're going to come back to that in a moment. But first, Lilith, how would you characterize relations, and do you agree that this is with Pavel, that this is perhaps the beginning of it getting much worse?
Well, I think the latest move by the U.S. Congress in terms of the sanctions dashed away the hopes of some of the Russian policymakers that perhaps there will be a reset in U.S.-Russian relationships, just like it happened when Obama was elected. That's not going to happen, and the worst thing is that with these new sanctions, as Pavel has been mentioning, most likely to stay in place for many years to come, the U.S.-Russian relationship is not going to improve significantly. Now, if politically this can be presented to Russian audience by the Russian president and his government as something that is not Russia's fault, economically for Russia, which is just entering a recovery period, to have a frozen relationship with the U.S., the largest economy in the world, is really bad news.
So there are ways for both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump to perhaps politicize and manipulate this topic, and we're going to explore that more. But first, I want to come back to you, John. Donald Trump in that tweet was very critical of Congress, and then in another series of tweets almost was basically saying that they made me do this. Is there any precedent for a president of the United States to attack his own party and not a foreign adversary?
That it's not completely unprecedented, but it's very rare. But the reason for this is simple. President Trump has shown, and candidate Trump has shown, no understanding of the dangers of the Kremlin's foreign policy, of how Kremlin foreign policy is aggressive and it hits hard against American interests. Congress passed the sanctions because they don't trust the president's instincts, and they're right not to trust those instincts.
So let me ask you this, though.
The president has been willing.
Let me ask you this: maybe this may be too much asking you to get into his head. We can only go by his actions, of course. But is it that he doesn't understand it, or he is just making his own choices regardless?
Well, he certainly is making his own choices. But if he cared about American interest, and if he understood those interests, he'd understand that Kremlin aggression in Ukraine, that Kremlin provocations in the Baltic states, that Kremlin interference in American and European elections all cut very hard against our interests. His national security team understands it. The vice president's statements on his recent trip to Georgia and to the Baltic states made that clear. Secretary Tillerson understands it. Secretary Mattis understands it. But it's not clear that the president understands it. And so Congress decided to make sure that the president could not pursue a policy of appeasement towards Kremlin aggression.
So having said
and
that... No, go ahead.
The spin that U.S.-Russian relations are terrible is a Russian propaganda spin. Moscow has been working hard against our interests for 8 or 10 years, and people don't talk about that. But it's the Kremlin cyber war on Estonia in 2007, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the seizure of Crimea in 2014, the ongoing war in the Donbass now, all are signs of clear aggression. And this is the reason why relations between the West and Russia, the United States and Russia, are bad, because the Kremlin is pursuing a policy of aggression.
So, Pavel, clearly the U.S. Congress is on one page, and to a certain degree, Barack Obama had been on a page of sanctions. Some may say too little, too late, but Donald Trump is obviously on a completely different page. Who do the Russian people see as running U.S. policy?
Well, the Russian people, at least the majority of the Russian people, kind of believe what they're force-fed by the very effective Russian propaganda machine. The Russian establishment really didn't most likely foresee or fully understand the scope of the separation of power in Washington and checks and balances. Because, of course, in Moscow, the Russian parliament, the upper house and lower house are just rubber stamps that just put into action any whim of the Kremlin. They're under total control. And for Russia to see a president in the White House who is seen as some kind of equivalent to Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin being subdued by his own legislature is kind of very, it's seen as a just simply a total loss of face. I mean, that is seen as a coup in Washington. And now, so now that we have to rethink our American politics because the American president turns out to be a non-entity. And we have to adapt to another kind of situation. That's the signals coming right now from the Kremlin and from the Russian establishment.
So, Lilith, Pavel is talking about having to adapt. I want to go back to Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev's tweet, where he could almost be said that he's trolling or needling Donald Trump. And he says the Trump administration has shown its total weakness by handing over executive power to Congress in the most humiliating way. When you take that and then you take Vladimir Putin's history, what does his history tell you about how Russia is going to respond?
Well, I think despite the rhetoric, what Russia can do under these circumstances is quite limited. They, as Pavel mentioned earlier, they do have a new foreign policy vision, which is also combined with their economic diplomacy. And what they're saying is solidifying their presence in former Soviet states, particularly bringing under the Russian firmer control of the members of the so-called Eurasia Economic Union. So I think what we'll see is much more assertive Russian policy towards these states, trying to create a more solid bloc. I think from Russian perspective, perhaps the advantages that they're seeing is that in terms of the electoral cycle, that's pretty much irrelevant in Russia's case, but things change in other countries, especially in the US. The worrying part, of course, is that both Democrats and Republicans are of the view that they have to have firm stance against Russia in the years to come. Now, from Russian perspective, it is really about weighing the advantages and disadvantages of this foreign policy that led to a current state of affairs, and see what they can control or what they can let go, and of course also look into Europe and see how they will build their relationship with European Union. So I would just put aside the rhetoric that we're hearing from Russia. It's a bit emotive, but really look as to where Russia stands. And I will again emphasize that to carry out all these ambitious projects, Russia has to have a viable and vibrant economy, which it doesn't have at the moment. And that's the backbone of all these campaigns.
Okay, so it's easier to paint the U.S. as the bad guy than to actually talk about the economic problems that Russia is having. Am I basically getting? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it's not just the economic problems. It's about this idea of sort of creating a zone of influence and assuming that the countries or the people of the countries that have joined the Eurasia Economic Union are happy about that, and that the impact on livelihood of people, and I would emphasize people because often these countries are run by really non-elected governments, that the people are not necessarily supportive or of sort of coming under the Russian influence and continuing to live under the practices like corruption and nepotism. Had they had a choice, perhaps some of these countries would prefer a Western or European integration path, but they are deprived of this choice. So this is where I think the main weakness is, and there's nothing that Russia is facing in its sort of quest, because it's not about US ultimately. It's about what they offer to their immediate neighbors and understanding why is it that these neighboring countries are really unhappy about what they're hearing from Russia and what they're seeing from Russia. Some of these countries are not really happy to lose some of their sovereignty. So that's the issue.
So actually, I want to talk about Ukraine, John, and I want to come back to you on this. So there's a report in The Economist that American officials and some of their European counterparts have actually discussed how to talk about what has happened in Ukraine, to use the terms aggression, war, Russian forces, instead of things like conflict and separatists. And that apparently, according to this report, that the administration has toyed with the idea of perhaps supplying arms to the troops in Ukraine. Does that ring true to you? Is that something that you could see Donald Trump actually doing?
I think that his secretaries of state and defense, his national security advisor, his vice president, and a strong majority in Congress, both Republican and Democrat, believe that we should give Ukraine means to defend itself from Kremlin aggression. So I'm not predicting it'll happen because the president has to ultimately decide, but I think there's a decent chance that it will happen. And it should. The Kremlin there'd be no war in the Donbass were it not for Kremlin financing, leadership, troops, and money, and weapons. And when Ukraine was on the verge in August of 2014 of retaking the entire Donbass, the Russian army, the regular Russian army, went in and defeated Ukrainian forces. Clearly aggression. And we should talk about it plainly because that's what's happening.
Pavel, was U.S. President Barack Obama too late and too ineffective with the sanctions once they started?
Well, sanctions, of course, make some difference, but they don't have an immediate effect. The effect of sanctions is always prolonged. And right now, the sanctions, though the official Russian line that these sanctions make only Russia stronger and more self-sufficient, there's a very serious behind-the-scenes discussion in and around the Kremlin. There's the so-called more liberal economic bloc of the government, the finance ministry, the central bank, former finance minister and Putin's advisor Alexei Kudrin, who are arguing that we should cut defense spending, we should scale down the confrontation with the West, spend more on human resources, on education, on medicine, on infrastructure, or we won't have economic growth, and that will undermine Russian security. And there is, of course, the defense ministry and the so-called power bloc in the government who want to have more defense spending, and for whom the problems right now, the worsening relations with America, are good news, because that's the best argument to have to press for more defense spending, more isolationism. And that also means that there's increased risk of more fighting inside Ukraine, since if we right now have so bad relations with America, then what's the problem? Why should we behave good? We maybe should go in and solve once and for all the Ukrainian problem. So that's the risk actually is growing, and this is also reflected inside infighting in Russia in decision-making bodies.
John, I want to ask you something you mentioned when you said that there are people in President Trump's cabinet that seem to advocate a different approach to Russia. But you mentioned Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, and there's reporting in Politico that says that he has turned down $80 million allocated by Congress to fight Russian disinformation, among other things. And the reporting is that one of the reasons he didn't take the money, is because he didn't want to anger Russia, if you will, as he tries to get some sort of balance in relations with Russia, in particular as it relates to Syria. What's your reaction to that, as Secretary of State turning down that kind of money to tackle something that the intelligence community says is a problem?
I have seen the report. It may be true, but I'm not certain that it is.
Okay.
If it is true, it may be that he turned it down because he wants to show his boss, President Trump, that he is able to reduce the expenses of the State Department. That seems to be a priority for Tillerson as a loyal lieutenant to the president. So again, I've seen the report. It may be true, but I'm a little skeptical.
Okay. Lilith, do you see any, and particularly considering what Pavel said about how much worse he thinks this could get, do you see any similarities of the path that Russia and the U.S. are on, any similarities to what happened in the 80s with the Soviet Union, or is that too extreme to you?
Well, I think in terms of these current sanctions, as Alexei Kudrin has mentioned in the past, and sort of the Russian Prime Minister alluded as well, it is very much similar to Jackson-Vanik amendments, which were applied by the US for many, many years. And it was linking trade relations with human rights violations in the then Soviet Union. To have some similar approach to Russia after all these years, after more than 25 years of Russia becoming an independent state, is definitely a worrying sign. However, the hope is that perhaps the warring camps that we're seeing within Russia, which we didn't have during the Soviet times, will provide a more reasonable review of what Russia is doing externally in its foreign policy, and sort of a real assessment whether it really makes sense to engage in this large confrontation with the West for some really limited foreign policy gains that ultimately will not bring any security or prosperity to Russian people. So the hope is that through these internal discussions, there will be a new revision, most potentially perhaps after the 2018 presidential election. So that's one scenario. But of course, there's also a worst case scenario where the Russian rulers find that using external confrontation is a very good distraction from domestic issues, corruption, and still very low living standards. So that's also quite likely. So I'm undecided which way it will go, but these are the two scenarios that I see at the moment.
John, whose move is it now? Vladimir Putin has said that the 755, I believe it is, staffers, U.S. staffers have been expelled from the country. Congress has now imposed these sanctions and basically told President Trump, you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and you can't do X, Y, and Z. What is next in this? Whose move is it now?
I suspect we'll see a lull. We took the action on sanctions. Putin responded to that as well as to the Obama sanctions at the end of 2016. And frankly, it will be much more damaging to Russia than to the United States if we have another round of measures taken. I think the Kremlin will try to continue to reach out to President Trump to maintain a good relationship with him. I think they'll try to work with us in Syria because they are overextended in Syria. And I suspect they will not do anything new and provocative in Ukraine, although we can't entirely rule that out. But there remains a chance, as we've already discussed, that the United States will decide to send defensive weapons, defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine to enable Ukraine to better defend itself. Okay, that is going to be the final word on this discussion. And I'm sure that we will continue to cover this topic. And we'll also continue to cover the grand jury investigation into alleged Russian hacking in the U.S. election. So thank you to all of my guests, John Herbst, Pavel Felgenhauer, and Lilith Gevorgian. And thank you all for watching as well. You can see the program again anytime if you visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Rochelle Carey, and the entire team, bye for now.